Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. We'll be looking at archival access, or if you build it, will they come? So here are weekly topics for this week. What are finding aids? What are barriers to access for archival researchers? And what role does digitization have in providing users access to archives? So we'll be looking at all 5 of our course learning objectives for this course. Okay, so just to put access, and especially online access, which we'll be focusing on for this lecture, in a little bit of context. This is typically something that is especially or most commonly developed, or I guess you could say accentuated. Sorry, that was a terrible joke. During this stage here of the more traditional archival life cycle. So after arrangement and description takes place, that's when increased access to the record is possible. And there's a strong connection between online access and use, or ease of use, which we will touch on during this lecture. Okay, so the two main or the two types of archival access that we're going to focus on for this lecture are online finding aids and online collections. So, generally speaking, the goal of archives is to provide access to records, right? So that they are useful for researchers in the purpose or in the future. And a lot of that access can come through interactions that researchers have with reference archivists, but very frequently these days, and this is something that will continue into the future, a lot of interaction between researchers and archival materials is through these two online formats or online vectors. And that can create some difficulties for researchers and difficulties for archivists as well. And it's just important to be aware of what these difficulties are and how archives can approach working against these barriers or these difficulties that that researchers may be experiencing. So we'll start by looking at some of the factors that can impact online access, both in the form of online finding aids and online collections as well. So donor agreements can be a big factor that can impact online access. So it may be that a donor wants their collection to be restricted and inaccessible, for years and years and years into the future. And that's something that may reduce the likelihood that an archive is going to invest the time and the resources in creating and making available an online finding aid for that collection record, simply because no one will be able to use it for, who knows how long. And the same goes for creating an online collection. Like if records are restricted, you're not going to place those records online and allow people to access them, because that would probably go against any restrictions that are included in the donor agreement that an archive has made with the donor of archival records. Arrangement and description can be a big factor influencing online access or the quality of online access. And we'll talk about this more later on, especially when we talk about online finding aids, but in a lot of ways, the quality of arrangement and description that archivists carry out or are able to carry out will determine the overall quality of online finding aids and online collections. So If archives have more accurate information to put in online finding aids, then obviously that's going to benefit researchers. If archives have more accurate metadata to attach to the records that make up online collections, then obviously that's going to benefit researchers because they're going to be looking at information that is factual and truthful and not information which may be incorrect or misinformed or misinterpreted. And the nature of records can also impact online access. So for instance, if records are in a particular file format that makes it difficult to place them online, then that can impact the future online access of a particular record. Or it may be that the content of the record or the context of the record just simply isn't important enough to invest the resources into placing records online for researchers to work with or for archives to provide a lot of information about records in online finding aid. So all these things are going to impact what the availability of accessible information about records is going to be. And a lot of these barriers to archives making information more accessible and placing more information online can be overcome if an archivist has a good relationship with the donor and or creator of records beforehand. So if archives work with records creators and or records donors, then a donor may not feel it's necessary to place restrictions on records because there's a level of trust between the donor and the archivist. If a records creator works with archives to provide them with accurate information about records, then that increases the quality of online finding aids and online collections down the road because archivists will be sharing information that is correct and factual and not incorrect. If archives work with records creators and donors ahead of time, then they may be able to encourage them to create records that are in formats that will be easier to provide online access to later on down the road. So there are a lot of benefits for working with donors and records creators ahead of time, which are going to make records more accessible in the online realm down the road. And it's also interesting to think of what we mean by accessible information. So not just the content itself, but the context as well. So two vital pieces of information that are going to facilitate the use and discovery of records and finding aids that have been placed online for researchers to use. So having not just the content, but the associated context associated both in online finding aids and online collections as well. And that's something that we'll talk about later on in this lecture. Okay, so the first type of online access that we're going to talk about is online collections. So this is where archives have either digitized records or acquired them already in digital form. Perhaps the records were born digital, and archives go ahead and take the steps to making these records available through some kind of online tool or resource. And there are a lot of factors that go into determining the quality of online collections. And a big one is that I've already touched on is contextual links. So do records that are placed online have links to other records that maybe relate to the same topic as the online record, or records, other records that were created by the individual that created the online record that a researcher is looking at. Just cues and tips and links that point researchers in the direction of related materials, instead of a record just being kind of an island that doesn't seemingly have much of a contextual relationship to any other record. And another way that online collections and the records that make up online collections can have value is if researchers are able to use them in ways that supports the information need that the researcher has, so that they can manipulate the records or save the records into a discrete sort of personal collection, or just use the records in a way that supports the information need that they have. And this is going to kind of vary from researcher to researcher. You know, some researchers might just be satisfied with seeing the record itself. Other researchers might have more kind of complex and complicated needs with those records. And to talk a little bit more about online collections, I have here a digital record, a digitized record from the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. So this is a letter from the Husband Edward Kimmel papers. Husband Kimmel was in charge of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base when it was attacked by the Japanese in 1941. And you know, he was kind of disgraced because people thought that Pearl Harbor should have been better prepared. And there was this whole sort of investigation into him and his activities. So a pretty interesting collection. And you know, it's not surprising that the AHC has decided to digitize at least some of this collection. And so this is a letter, as you can see here, written from Kimmel to his mother in 1908. You can tell from the actual content. And so this is the kind of metadata associated with this record. So it has some subjects here, a nice description, and then information about the AHC as the publisher, and so on and so forth. It has a source here. It has this relation tag, which we'll look at in just a little bit. But yeah, so it's interesting to look at some of the contextual clues or features that this record has. So you can click on subject, and it says search all fields, search subject for the Kimmel family, and it will bring up relevant results within the AHC's digital collections. So not surprisingly, they're all from the Kimmel papers. Maybe it would be better if somehow this linked to other online collections from other archives, and then you would get more of a sense of other records out there that might be also related to Husband Kimmel's family, and you would get sort of a bigger understanding of information that way. And you can do the same for United States Navy. So a couple of ways to kind of search for the bigger picture of Husband Kimmel's family, and perhaps some other information related to the United States Navy. But again, it's kind of it is limited to just the AHC's online collections. Another piece of contextual information is here, where it shows you that this record comes from the Husband Edward Kimmel papers, and it shows you the box number, accession number, and so on. So just kind of giving you a hint that other records can be in this collection. You can search for the source, and that will bring up all the other online records related to this collection. So again, just kind of providing you a little bit of contextual information and saying, hey, there's other stuff within this collection that you might want to look at that's also online. And then you can't really, it's not really clear, but this is supposed to be a link to the online fine aid for the Husband-Kimmel papers, but if you click on it, you get a 404. So that's contextual information that we do lose. There's not a clear link between this online record and the fine aid for the collection that this record comes from. So you can tell that it comes from another collection, but you can't really get the bigger picture of what else might be in that collection because this is a dead link. And we'll look at the online fine aid for the Kimmel papers later on. So there is an online fine aid for it, but unfortunately this link hasn't been updated. And so that really removes a big contextual tool that could be used for this particular assignment, or this record, I'm sorry. There are some additional things you can do with these records. So you can zoom in if you want to admire the penmanship or whatever. You can add this image to a workspace. So if you want to compile specific records that might be from different collections and have those all in one place, you can do that, which is helpful for researchers. You can add media to a group. So if you have like file videos or something, you can do that. There's actually a way to add annotations to records, which it might be helpful for researchers. So just some tools. You can maximize it if you really want to get a closer look. So there are some tools for manipulating this record, which some researchers may want. Some researchers may not necessarily desire to use those tools, but I guess they're good to have. So having records online, like the one we just saw, represents one of a range of access possibilities that exist. So researchers may not know it or realize it, but only a very small percentage of archival records are actually available online, just because archives don't really have the resources or even the need or the desire to place all their records online. So it takes up server space and just a lot of resources the archives might not have. So records in an archive actually exist across sort of a spectrum of accessibility, ranging from very closed access to somewhat open to very open access. So here in the closed spectrum of access, we have records that are not digitized, or if they are digitized, are restricted to on-site access only for some reason. So you would have to go into the archive itself to view those records. That may be a restriction sort of placed on these records, maybe because of the format that the record is in, or due to donor restrictions. There may be copyright reasons why this is true. Or it may be that the record is only in paper form and it hasn't been scanned or anything yet. So obviously you may need to come to the archive and to actually look at those records. And then you have the somewhat open part of this spectrum. So records may be digitized. They may be accessible online, but they can't be downloaded by a researcher. So you can look at the records, but you can't actually download them and keep them on your own computer. So the format does make remote access a possibility, or online access, but they don't really leave archival custody because of this prohibition on downloading materials. And again, this may be due to donor agreements or some kind of legal concerns by the archive. So here's something where copyright might rear its ugly head. And archives may fear that if records are more open, then they may get a letter from a lawyer one day. And we'll talk about copyright later on in the semester. And then finally, you have a very open level of access. So this is where records have been digitized, or they maybe were born digital. The records can be accessed and copies can be downloaded at home by researchers. So you can find an online collection and download the records and really do whatever you want with them. So a very open idea of access. And this is one that I would say is increasingly common among archives. As researchers become more and more desirous of this type of access, and as maybe fears about copyright become lessened, archives typically at least strive to provide this more open level of access so that there aren't barriers between researchers and archival materials. So the more closed access is, the more work a researcher has to go through to access materials. So if you can only see records in a reading room at an archive, then you may have to travel, across the city, across the state, across the country, all the way to Laramie, Wyoming, if you want to access those records. Whereas obviously, if records are very open, you can just sit in the comfort of your own home, sipping tea, munching on your sunflower seeds, and look at records to your heart's content. So it's also important to note that there may be varying levels of access within a collection. So some parts of a collection may require you to go to the archive to look at them, and some parts of the collection may be available online for you to download. So a very small part of the Kimmel collection that we just looked at has been digitized and placed online. And the rest, you have to go through more work to access those collections, whether it's going to the HC itself or working with reference archivists there to have records downloaded, or scanned and sent to you. And this kind of goes back to the idea of mediations and value judgments that we've talked about. So why do archives choose to make some records more open and sort of more available for researchers, and other records not open and not as available to researchers? And that's something that we will talk about in just a minute. So other factors that may influence how digital materials are accessed and sort of what spectrum of accessibility digital records might have depend, at least in part, on these four criteria here. So the data format, so going back to the idea of the nature of the record, the researcher location, the transfer method, and restrictions. So looking at data formats, if a record is in its sort of original format or original form, it may be inaccessible for researchers. So it may be in a format that isn't easily placed online without some kind of changes being done to the record. And so that is going to be less accessible simply because archivists can't really put it online in a easy way. One thing that can be possible is records can be emulated, which the Waugh article from last week touches on with the Salman Rushdie papers. But again, that can require significant effort. Records may be migrated and placed online, but that can raise some authenticity questions if the migrated version doesn't really match the original version. And there's something called a disk image, which can be taken, but that has some privacy and legal concerns. So that's essentially a really comprehensive picture of what the records are and information about the records. So yeah, the format that the data is in can really impact how accessible or inaccessible materials are. And, as I touched on, there are some authenticity concerns they sort of go into that as well. The researcher location can obviously have an influence. So whether it's in person or remote, that's going to depend on how materials are accessed. So obviously being in the reading room versus accessing things from the comfort of your own home. Looking at transfer method, the difference between physical or offline transfer, that's going to be more labor intensive, as I touched on. It may require you to go to the actual archive to look at the papers there, or maybe work on a computer that that access to collections has been restricted to, or it can be online from the comfort of your own home through some kind of online repository or collection tool, and facilitated by some kind of software or other technical infrastructure. And then we touched on some restrictions as well, ranging from where items may only be discovered through a search for metadata, or maybe the metadata can be viewed but not the actual content itself. It may be that researchers can look at the record but not actually download it, or it can be that researchers can actually download the content of the file. So all these things, kind of elaborating on things that we've talked about before, are going to impact how the materials are accessed. So, are they going to be accessed in their original format or in a different format? Are they going to be accessed at home or online? Is it going to be a physical offline transfer of information, or is it something that can be done through an online repository? And exactly what kind of restrictions are in place that can impact how the materials are accessed. So when it comes to online access, as with so many things that archives have to deal with, it's really a balancing act. And the greater the hassle to process records and provide access to them, the less likelihood of in-depth access being provided. So again, if records are in a format that is really difficult for archivists to work with, then it's less likely that they're going to end up in an online repository in the future. And you connect this balancing act to these different criteria, which are actually pretty similar to how deeply collections are processed. So some of the things that we talked about last week when we talked about levels of processing and how deep or specific processing might be, the same is true with online access. So volume of records, if a collection is huge, then that makes it less likely that a whole collection is going to be scanned and placed online. Less of an issue if records are born digital or have been digitized prior to coming into the archive, but it can still be a concern because you still have to find server space to have these records available to researchers and other kind of technical infrastructure. The quality of the content, so records that are perceived by the archive for whatever reason to be more valuable or more useful to researchers are ones that are going to be more likely to be more accessible to researchers, simply because somewhere an archivist is saying, yes, this really has value, this is an important part of a collection, or this collection is an important part of our holdings. So we want to make sure to have these collections or these records as widely available as possible. And kind of relate to that is quality of metadata. So the quality of the information about the content that researchers have and that the archive has. So if a collection has really great metadata, or a record has really great metadata, then that may make it more likely for the archives to place those records online. Authenticity can be an issue as well. So again, this idea that if you have to migrate records or change them significantly in order to place them online, that may make an archive say, well, it's really not worth it because that really impacts the authenticity of these records, maybe to a point where they're not really useful for researchers anymore. So that can be a consideration for a level of access and whether or not records are placed in an online collection. Any restrictions, we touched on that. A big one, and really maybe the most important one, is the ability of the archive. So does the archive overall have the ability to place these records online in an online collection and sort of maintain them online, for the indefinite future, or is that kind of beyond the capabilities of the archive? And another one, which I kind of have mixed feelings about, is perceived future use. So if a archivist thinks that records are going to be used in the future for whatever reason, then that may compel them to place them online and sort of facilitate that future use. So, again, a lot of these are value judgments that archives make. So quality of content, quality of metadata, that can be pretty subjective. Perceived future use, that can be pretty subjective. But these choices that archives make, these mediations that archives make, can determine how useful records are in the future, and to a great extent, how likely they are to be used. So again, it just goes back to convenience. If you have a set of records that you need to go halfway across the country or play email tag with an archivist to get scanned copies of, versus a set of records that you can just find in an online repository and access and use really easily, 9 times out of 10, you're going to choose the records that are easy to access. And that may be despite the fact that the records that you choose not to access may actually have a lot of great content and a lot of great value. But if those records are more difficult, then you just might throw up your hands and say, well, it's just not worth it. I'm going to kind of go with the low-hanging fruit here. So these decisions that archivists make about how accessible records are, really can impact social memory, because if researchers choose not to use records because they are inaccessible or less accessible, then that may be a perspective or a viewpoint that gets lost and gets lost to history. So the records may exist in an archive technically, but if they're extremely difficult to access because they haven't been placed online, then it's like a tree falling in the woods. If archives are moldering on a shelf or on a server somewhere, but no one's actually looking at them or using them, then sort of what value do they have, or what are they really contributing to history and social memory? So these access determination choices that archives have, even though they are subjective, can have a lot of impact in how people view themselves, their community, history in general, and that can have a big impact on society. So important considerations for archivists to make, and hopefully considerations that they're prepared to justify somehow. So it's important to think of access on a continuum basis. So it's important for archives to understand how and why records were accessed prior to donation. So any contextual information about the records is important for archives to know that, so that they can make more informed decisions about which content is important and which content should be placed online, or what contextual clues or tools to use in online records. And just generally speaking, as the Matusiak article touches on, if records are not brought into archives, they cannot be digitized and placed online. So, records made kind of downstream, as we talked about, really can affect how accessible records are in the future. It's also important to realize that access can change over time. So records may initially be in a very closed spectrum of access, and as they kind of move along, as time passes, for whatever reason, they may become more and more open and more easier for researchers to access. So it may be that the archive has more resources to digitize things or to support online collections, and so they are able to provide more records online. And maybe that the records are perceived as being more important than maybe they were initially. But there are a lot of factors that can sort of change the accessibility of a record as time passes. But of course, not every record makes this transition, and a lot of records, maybe even, well, no, a vast majority of records sort of remain either closed or somewhat accessible, for as long as they exist. And again, that can result in a loss of contextual knowledge and a loss of understanding of certain events, places, and people in society and in history. So as this quote from the Ames Working Group describes, in an online collection environment, a researcher may have no engagement with an archivist. They may be sort of totally on their own as they are navigating through an online collection and trying to determine which records are relevant, which records meet their information needs. And this isolation of the record in an online environment can reduce an archive's ability to provide key services. So to provide feedback about which records are important, because there's not really an interaction between a reference archivist and a researcher. And so because of this, this lack of interaction between the researcher and an archivist, it really is important that online collections point the way. And this is something that the FORCE article for this week really touches on, the need for archivists to provide contextual information for researchers, and especially contextual information that provides or supports the aha moments that researchers really look, the moments where they're finding something and then they see something else that connects to what they're looking for, and they can go and explore that and look at that, and they sort of go through the sequence where they're constantly discovering information that supports whatever research need they have. And if this contextual information is not provided to researchers, then this sort of chaining of information or this chaining of discovery can really be made more difficult. And this lack of contextual information can be a huge barrier for researchers to navigate. And so the FORCE article suggests some types of contextual information that that online records and online collections should have. So maybe contextual information that points to records that were created by the same creator, so the same provenance, or it might be records that were perhaps in the same collection, but may have different creators. And you can kind of go even further. You could say different collections that have different creators, and sort of point out how records may be related to each other, even if they're in different collections created by different people. So you can expand contextual webs, really as far as you want. And, at a certain point, maybe it's not as useful because the sort of connections start to get, less and less useful. But at least to a certain point, if you keep kind of directing researchers towards more contextually related information, then that's going to increase their ability to understand what they're looking at and how to use what they're looking at in ways that they can solve their information need, as opposed to just kind of providing this sort of island of information that doesn't have any connection to any other records or any other collection material, and saying, okay, well, good luck finding out how this relates to other stuff that we have or that other archives have. That's really a disservice to researchers, especially ones they may not have the experience necessary to find contextual information unless archivists are there to point the way. And you can't see it, but I just lifted up my hand and pointed at something here in the room when I said that to really kind of emphasize how important this is. And from the Matusiak article, one of the criticisms that the researchers had was this lack of contextual information, and they didn't feel like there were connections made to other relevant information from their community. And again, a part of this was because these records just didn't exist because they weren't collected, because archives thought they weren't important. But they feel like there could have been more contextual relationships developed. And so again, this is where metadata becomes important, and the ability to link metadata to other related records. And the FORCE article really advocates also for having links to the finding aid related to the collection that a online record is from. So again, ideally that would have been found in the Kimmel record that we looked at. Unfortunately, that link led to a 404, a dead link. So that's really not great, because you do want to represent how records are related to other collections in the same collection, many of which are not going to be placed online as clearly as possible, and that wasn't really happening with the example that we saw. So speaking of online find aids, that is the next topic of our discussion for our Access Week. So online find aids are a key way for researchers to learn more about a set of records. And in a lot of ways, they are the manifestation of processing work done by archival staff. So a manifestation of the arrangement description that we talked about last week. The descriptions and arrangements that archives make, those decisions, that research and that sort of compilation of information about a collection is going to be manifested in the form of a finding aid. So there is a lot of connections, as I talked about before, between the quality of online finding aids and the quality of processing work done prior to the finding aids creation. So it really speaks to the importance of arrangement and description. And so we talked about MPLP last week. MPLP can result in some pretty superficial processing work done, and that can impact the quality of the online finding aids that researchers have to work with in the future. And so that can be a barrier that can really impact researchers, is just poor arrangement and description leading to poor online finding aids, which may be the only way that they learn about a collection. So online finding aids typically contain something called an abstract, something called a biographical historical note, a collection level scope and content, and a container list. And so in just a second, we'll look at an online finding aid from the American Heritage Center. Again, we'll look at the online finding aid for the Husband-Kimmel papers. Most collections have some kind of online finding aid available in one form or another, just of varying quality with varying contextual information attached to it. But archives do realize the value of having online finding aids available, again, sort of in one form or another, to sort of varying degrees of complexity and quality. And a really beneficial thing is that increasingly online finding aids can be created in tools like ArchiveSpace, which if you take our arrangement and description course, you'll learn more about ArchiveSpace and how to use it. Of course, the functionality of online finding aids created by tools can be pretty basic, and there may be a need for archives to mediate and ways to increase the value or usability of online finding aids. So to maybe provide more contextual tools for researchers to look at, maybe to adjust the language or how the records are represented to make them more palatable or usable for researchers. And that's something that we'll focus on later. It's something that the Walton article for this week touches on. So here is an online find aid from the American Harris Center. So again, for the Husband Edward Kimmel papers. So you can see some pretty basic descriptive information here. The creator, Husband Kimmel, the title, the dates, the collection number. So a quick summary of the collection itself, the contents, or I'm sorry, of Kimmel's life, repository information, any access restrictions, and so on. A brief bio of Husband Kimmel, a brief description of what's in the actual collection, some other information, any related materials. So this would be a good place where you could provide contextual information if it existed. So maybe there's not stuff about Husband Kimmel, but there's probably a ton of stuff about Pearl Harbor, right? So why not include links to that just to provide a little bit more information about, really the most significant event in Kimmel's life. So yeah, a good way to, a good place to provide more contextual information. And it definitely seems like that could have been a possibility here. So again, maybe not created by Husband Kimmel, but here are some additional collections that are related to Pearl Harbor, or so on. Just to show that this isn't the only collection out there, and to make it convenient for researchers who might be looking for records that are related to what they're looking at, right? To sort of build out the contextual web. And then you have the container list. So on left here, we have some nice links to go through if you just want to look at the correspondence series, not background materials. You can go right to that, and so on. So this is nice to be able to kind of click around and navigate. So yeah, pretty sort of functional and basic online find aid. If you click here, or if you scroll all the way down, you can see that there are some subject terms which might provide some contextual information. So if we click on this, it will take us to other find aids that are related to the attack in Pearl Harbor, but only within this Archives West online repository. So not in archives that aren't part of this consortia of online finding aids. So there is some contextual information here, but again, it's kind of buried all the way down at the bottom. And it doesn't really build up maybe as far as it could if it connected to archives in other consortia as well. And you can do that with the personal names as well, and corporate names too. So there we go. So yeah, there are some contextual tools here. Maybe not as developed as they could be, but some is better than nothing, and you could probably more or less find what you're looking for just through what the agency has. And then there are some good connections to the digitized materials from the Kimmel paper that the agency has. So if you click on this link here, it will bring up the records that we were looking at before. So that's really great. It's unfortunate that there isn't the same connection back between this individual record and the online find aid, because I don't know if they switched hosts or whatever, but again, this is a dead link, so it kind of just goes one way. I guess better to have one way than no way, but it's not a given that people are going to come through an online find aid, and they may not be aware of how to access the online find aid, or the online find aid even exists if they access the HC through its online collections and not through its online finding aids. So ideally, this goes two ways. I think it's meant to go two ways. Maybe they just need to update their links, but yeah. So some good things here in the online find aid, but there's always more opportunities to kind of push out this contextual web to really broaden the idea of what is related, to kind of push things beyond just what's in this archival consortia, and really help researchers find more information that they may be looking for. So as the Walton article notes, online find aids have evolved over time. So again, from static physical documents that you needed to be in the reading room to look at, or maybe you could have mailed to you, to the online interfaces like the one that we just saw. So, there was a world where there were no online find aids, and then it was more common for there to be online catalogs, and then it was more common for there to be online find aids. And finally, this dazzling modern world where we live now, where there are online find aids with connections to digital records like we just saw. So not only have records themselves become more accessible over time as technology has improved, but the online find aids that facilitate the use of records, that's become more accessible as well, which is a good thing. The Walton article focuses on the usability of online find aids, and argues that online find aids were created without input from researchers. So it was just archivists themselves thinking, how do we need to structure this? What information do we need to include? How do we need to present this information? And this was a process that was done without asking researchers or people that are going to use these find aids what they actually want. And as the article notes, this can result in online find aids that have things such as archival jargon, huge blocks of text, really complex hierarchies like series and subseries and sub-subseries that researchers don't really want or they don't really understand. And so that can be a big barrier to online access as well. Just online find aids that aren't user-friendly or aren't really comprehensible to researchers that are interested in using records. And so, again, that can result in researchers just getting frustrated and saying, okay, well, I'm not really gonna, slog through this this block of text. I'm not gonna slog through all these subseries to try and find what I want. I'm just gonna kind of move on, and hopefully I can find my information somewhere else, which is obviously not a good situation for archives at all. So there really is increasingly an emphasis on making online find aids more intuitive and more useful for researchers. And there are some archives out there that do a really good job of this, especially Princeton University have been kind of at the frontier of incorporating features that researchers want and not really saddling researchers with features for aspects of find aids that they just aren't really interested in or may find frustrating. So generally speaking, online access can facilitate use by, again, connecting find aids to online collection materials. So we saw at least an attempt at that just now. Helping researchers search between images. So in an online world, really facilitating the ability of researchers to search intuitively and easily. Connecting records to external resources. So again, building up these contextual webs that can help researchers find relevant information. Another At one time, increasingly common and valued idea was to allow researchers to comment and tag materials and have those be available to other researchers. That's not really something that's been done by archives too much, simply because then it becomes a question of who's going to sort of moderate that and make sure that the information is actually useful. But it could be a way that archives or that researchers could learn more about materials and sort of get a perspective beyond just the archivists. And another interesting idea is to link records to uses of records. So if you have an online fine aid or online collections, providing a way for researchers to view, maybe scholarly articles written about Husband Kimmel or scholarly records related to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And again, just sort of keep building out these contextual webs and really enlarging the scope of archives and saying the information that we're going to provide you doesn't just begin and end within this archive, but we're going to try and provide information, from sources all over the country or all over the world. And again, some of these are going to be more useful to particular researchers. So researchers may not really care about having links to the uses of records, or they may not care to read the comments and tags from other researchers. And so it just goes back to trying to do the most for the most amount of people and knowing who your researchers are and what sort of features they typically enjoy and sort of curtailing your online access both in the form of online fine aids and online collections to support those sort of needs and those resources. And so again, the more features you have that facilitate use, the easier it is going to be for researchers to use your materials, and the more likely they are going to be to use your materials. So I've talked about this before in this lecture, but yeah, if people are frustrated by your online fine aids, if they find your online collection sort of dense and unintuitive to get through to find the information that they want, then they're just going to kind of walk away and not use your materials. And it's just interesting to think of online access as a form of outreach. If people come to your online fine aids or online collections and they find resources that are really easy to use, that are intuitive to use, then that's going to increase their sort of appreciation of your archives. And, they may advocate for your archives to other friends or colleagues that may be looking for similar records. They may be more inclined to use your archives again and again, which can really help in archives justify its value and justify its existence. And this is something that I talk more about in the 752 course that I teach, but the better these resources are and the more intuitive and easy they are for researchers to use, the more people are going to value archives and the more people are going to want to use the archives in the future. And that can definitely be beneficial for archives when they have to say, well, here's why we deserve funding. Here's why we deserve to exist. So apart from the whole idea of just like providing access to records is kind of the right thing, and archives should always strive to do that well, there are definitely other benefits to doing that as well, sort of just beyond the, the reason why archives exist. So we'll wrap things up by looking at these different types of creators and how they can impact what access looks like. So we've talked about creation by the individual traditionally named as the creator, and also by custodians. So these people may impact restrictions, which can reduce the accessibility of records. It's interesting to think of archives working with communities to help understand the context of records and how they can best illustrate that context within online access, so within online fine aids or online collections. That would be a really great way to develop contextual webs that are accurate and accurate and respectful of a community. Obviously, a lot of these access decisions are made by archivists, so that can definitely impact what resources a researcher has to look at or how they interpret resources. And it's also interesting to think of creation by activators. So maybe as researchers work with records, they can suggest ways that archives can provide greater context to them, provide greater contextual information to the archive. Perhaps as researchers work with records and maybe realize that they're more important than the archives initially thought, then that can lead to records moving along this progression to being more accessible in the future. So there are a lot of ways that activators or researchers can impact what access looks like in archives as well. Okay, so we'll wrap things up there. I hope this was an interesting lecture. I hope it's helped you think about online access more critically, maybe in a different way than you had previously. And there are definitely a lot of legal and ethical issues related to access that we touched on today, and we'll touch on more in the future. So some of these things will be discussed at greater depth. We'll talk about how reference can be impacted by access, how reference can impact access. So we'll kind of continue building out from here and making other connections between other aspects of archival administration and online access. So something to look forward to. All right, take care. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon.